This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host G. Sampath. 7 months into Israel's military assault on Gaza, more than 32,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed, more than 78,000 wounded, and the whole of Gaza is on the brink of famine. Earlier, there was an air of optimism when Hamas announced that it had accepted a 3-phase ceasefire proposal brokered by Qatar and Egypt, and Israel even sent a delegation to Cairo to discuss this further. But in the interim, during this week, Israel has launched strikes on the city of Rafah in southern Gaza Strip and taken over the border crossing there, which was critical for sending humanitarian aid to Gaza. Meanwhile, President Biden has paused a major shipment of bombs headed for Israel, signaling that US weapons should not be used to target Palestinian civilians. So what are the details of the ceasefire proposal that Hamas has accepted but Israel hasn't? Is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu serious at all about the ceasefire negotiations, or has he merely been using it as a cover to prepare for the Rafah operation, as is being alleged by Hamas? And with international public opinion mounting against the continued Israeli assault, has there been any shift in Washington's position? We discuss all these questions in detail in this episode of In Focus, and we are joined by Stanley Johnny, the Hindu's International Affairs editor. Stanley, thank you so much for joining us and welcome back to In Focus.
Thank you, Sampath.
So Stanley, I was wondering to start with if you can explain what exactly is this 3-phase ceasefire proposal brokered by Qatar and Egypt that Hamas has accepted but Israel hasn't. How did they even make it public when one side hasn't really accepted it?
The fine details of this proposal are still not officially released, basically. But there were extensive reports in the Arab media, especially in the Egyptian and Saudi media. And the Wall Street Journal had also run a story saying that they reviewed the discussion points, that were taken up by all the sides in Cairo, in the Cairo talks. So we have a vague idea of what this 3-phase ceasefire proposal is from these reports. So, in the first phase, Hamas is expected to release some 33 to 38 refugees, I think 33. Initially it was 40, but then came down to 33. And then the Israelis would release Palestinian prisoners many more times. I don't have the exact number, but it's roughly what they discussed was 4 Palestinian prisoners for 1 hostage. So maybe 120 plus Palestinian prisoners. And then there would also be a 6-week ceasefire. So this was the initial proposal. This is the first phase of the ceasefire proposal. And in the second phase, Hamas would release all the living hostages. And the Israelis would free more Palestinian prisoners. And the ceasefire would be extended for another 6 to 8 weeks. But then the third phase comes. I think the major disagreements are there in the third phase, because in the third phase, Hamas is expected to release the bodies of all hostages who were killed either on October 7th or in the subsequent weeks. And Israel has to end. What Hamas demands is that Israel has to agree to a comprehensive, lasting ceasefire in the third phase, not just extension of the ceasefire for a few more weeks. And Hamas also demands Israel withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip. So as of now, if you look at Gaza, Recently Israel sent troops to the Rafah border, but then that is a limited number of Israeli forces. But then at least 2 Israeli brigades have been deployed in central and northern Gaza. So northern Gaza, which encompasses Gaza City, which was the most populous city in Gaza, is now a ghost land, and Israeli troops have been deployed there. And IDF still identifies northern Gaza as a war zone. So effectively, Israel has now carved up a no man's land between southern Gaza and the Israeli border. So the entire northern Gaza is now controlled by the Israeli military. So Hamas says that Israel has to withdraw from the entire Gaza Strip. So whether Israel actually plans to withdraw from the Gaza Strip or Israel is planning to use northern Gaza as a buffer between the Gaza population who are now living in, crammed into southern Gaza and Israel proper, which we don't know. So I think the major disagreements are there in the third phase. So when Hamas says it accepted this proposal, I think what Hamas means is that it is ready to release 33 hostages in the first phase, it is ready to release all the living hostages in the second phase, and it is ready to release the mortal remains of the hostages, but only if there is a comprehensive ceasefire agreement and Israel agrees to withdraw from the whole of Gaza Strip. But Netanyahu is not ready to accept this.
Right. So anyway, even if, let us say, if Hamas were to agree to release the remains of the dead hostages and all the living hostages, why would they do that and give up all their leverage if they are going to again be back in square one, have Israelis attacks on Gaza Strip again? Without a comprehensive ceasefire and withdrawal, how is there anything on the table for Hamas here?
Exactly. That is a logical question. But on the other side, what the Israelis are trying to say is that if they withdraw from Gaza, for the release of the hostages, and if they bring the war to an end, they are not meeting their objective. And they had set these twin objectives of releasing the hostages and destroying Hamas. And, 7 months after the war, they haven't met either of the two. And the third objective, which is an indirect objective, is to bolster Israel's deterrence. They are far from that. In fact, Israel's deterrence, we all know that took a shattering when the Iranians launched the attack in April. So what, to release hostages, the Israelis and the Americans, the Egyptians and the Qataris, and everybody now knows that the only practical way to release the hostages is to strike a deal with Hamas. And Hamas says that we are ready to strike that deal, but only if there is a comprehensive agreement, because as you pointed out, otherwise, why should Hamas release all the hostages and then be ready to fight the Israelis again? So I think this is the major stumbling block to achieve the peace. But on the other side, the Israelis think that if they accept a comprehensive ceasefire, if the war comes to an end, Hamas would remain in Gaza. So according to the Israeli argument, which means Hamas would live to strike us another day, and Israel doesn't want that to happen. So I think this is the major disagreement between Hamas position and the Israeli position.
Right. Now, I was just wondering, given that Israel is keen on, basically Israel wants to ensure the destruction of the party it is negotiating with for a ceasefire, to put it bluntly. Now, in that case, how serious is it really about the ceasefire negotiations? We are saying you have to stop, we'll have a ceasefire and then we'll come back and kill you all, So does Netanyahu really need the war to go on for his political survival at home? Or will Israel agreeing to a ceasefire be perceived as some sort of quote-unquote defeat, as it were, in the domestic public opinion? Like, how serious is Israel at all, in this entire negotiation?
Yeah, it's a very complicated situation in Israel. We don't have simple answers to this question, but you look at the different stakeholders in Israel to understand the situation which Israel is in. At the end of the day, this is an elected government. This is a far-right government, but an elected government. And the pressure is building on the government to get the hostages released. Because it's been 7 months, right? The attack itself is a major security failure on Mr. Netanyahu's behalf. The Prime Minister promised security to the whole of Israel, and the worst attack in Israel's history took place on his watch. That's a historical fact. And then he said that we will destroy Hamas, we will bring them home. And Israel has been fighting Hamas or attacking Gaza for the last 7 months. And the war, as we have seen, has turned up international pressure on Israel. The state is now near total isolated. There are problems in the relationship between the United States and Israel as well. There is a genocide case against Israel in the ICJ, and there could be arrest warrants against Netanyahu and the Israeli generals, which is a possibility. In the global south, there is mounting anger against Israel. The Arab-Israel peace process has been demolished, at least for now. And the Americans trying to revive the Arab-Israel peace agreement, they are basically fighting the wind. So Israel has suffered multiple setbacks in the last 7 months. And the hostages are still hostages. And the Hamas is far from being destroyed. And domestically, the pressure is mounting on the Netanyahu government to release the hostages. And the only practical solution to get the hostages released at this point of time is to strike a deal with Hamas. But Hamas, again, why should they strike a deal with the Israelis if the Israelis are coming back to kill them? So there is no easy path towards a comprehensive agreement between Hamas and Israel. So this is a very complicated situation. And on top of it, as you mentioned, Mr. Netanyahu's political career is also hanging in balance. Because if the war comes to an end, once the dust settles, there will be questions. There will be questions about the October 7 attack. There will be questions about the way the war is being conducted. There will be questions about the April 14 Iranian attack. There will be questions about how Israel responded to the Iranian attack and why the Israeli response was so feeble. There will be questions about the deteriorating relationship between Israel and the United States, which is the biggest security guarantor of Israel for the last 50, 70 years. So Mr. Netanyahu will have to answer a lot of questions once the dust settles. So basically, this is also a problem because if you look at it from Netanyahu's point of view, he faced back-to-back setbacks and failures, and his political career is also hanging in balance now. So there is no easy solution here. But at the same time, Israelis, I think, they keep negotiating with Hamas because they can't afford to shut down talks in today's political climate in Israel because, even members in Mr. Netanyahu's war cabinet, including Benny Gantz, is supporting an agreement, right? And Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, had repeatedly blasted Netanyahu and the Jewish terrorists. He used the term Jewish terrorist attack on the Palestinians in the settlement colonies in the West Bank. And he says Netanyahu is basically destroyed Israel's deterrence. And Yair Lapid has called for early election. Benny Gantz has called for early election. So there is, the political situation in Israel is also highly complicated, and Netanyahu is facing heat from all sides. So he has to keep negotiating. But at the same time, he is unable to find a solution that would address Israel's security concerns, that would get the hostages released, that would also protect his political future. And that is a magical solution. Netanyahu is not able to find that.
Right. Now, Stanley, you referred to the deteriorating, or maybe not deteriorating, maybe some friction, let us say, in the relationship between Israel and Washington with the United States. Now, President Biden has paused, he has not cancelled, he has paused the shipment of bombs, 700 kg bombs, which are really too big and too powerful to be used in such a densely populated civilian space such as Rafah, where Israel is sort of wanting to attack and launch a major strike. So what is the significance of this pausing of weapons shipment by Biden? Do you think it will have any effect on Israel's plans for Rafah? And why exactly is Israel so intent on attacking such a civilian hotspot? Rafah is where there are so many thousands of refugees, who are already displaced from elsewhere. Now again they are being evacuated to some other place. So why does it actually believe that by attacking Rafah they will flush out the last of the Hamas hideouts and kill every single one of Hamas soldiers? Is that what they are actually thinking?
I'm at loss here. I'm struggling to understand the military strategy of Israel's operation. I don't think there is a proper military strategy here. Israel is being vengeful, and the civilian casualties do not prevent them, which is a fact because 34,900 Palestinians have already been killed. You haven't seen any regret on the Israeli side. Israel expressed apology only over the bombing of the aid workers, foreign Western aid workers, because Westerners were killed. But about the Palestinians, there is no regret, right? So the civilian hotspot of Rafah, the fact that 1.4 million people are living in a small city, that would not deter Israel from attacking Rafah. Israel doesn't care about Palestinian civilian lives, which is a fact. But at the same time, operational concerns are there because Israel's argument is that 4 more Hamas battalions are there still in Rafah. And if Israel wants to meet its objective of destroying Hamas, it has to attack Rafah. Because if it doesn't attack Rafah and strikes a deal with Hamas, that means Hamas will survive, including Hamas top leaders. That is Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif and others. The Israelis said immediately after October 7 that they were dead men walking, right? But they're still alive. So these are the challenges Israel is also facing. So for Israel, if it wants to achieve victory, it has to attack Rafah and destroy Hamas. Otherwise, it is not winning the war. Like Henry Kissinger once famously said, the guerrilla wins the war by surviving. Otherwise, the guerrilla, if the guerrilla survives, it wins the war, and the bigger conventional power loses the war. So for Israel is actually facing defeat in this war if it doesn't go into Rafah and destroy Hamas.
I mean, let's say they go into Rafah and Hamas knows that the Israeli troops are coming. Maybe they will evacuate themselves and move somewhere else. They may not be waiting for them in Rafah. I mean, is that a possibility, or are they going to be a finale kind of a pitched battle between the two sides and one side wins? I mean, in guerrilla warfare, the guerrillas are not going to be waiting for you and being a target. I mean,
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen if Israel attacks Rafah. The only certain thing we know is that it would be a bloodbath. WHO has warned it, the UN has warned it. Civilian casualties will mount because we are talking about, a small city where 1.4 million people are living without food, without basic amenities. And Israel is bombing this place continuously. And if it launches a ground invasion, the only certain thing is that the casualties will mount. But for Hamas leadership, their options to evacuate themselves is also limited at this point of time because, as we discussed earlier, central and northern Gaza central and northern parts of Gaza are already controlled by the Israeli military. And now, after taking over the Rafah crossing, the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing to Egypt, basically Israel is now controlling all the entry and exit points of Gaza. So Hamas leadership, I mean, theoretically speaking, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif cannot escape Gaza. So that's what Israel wants. Israel wants to take over. Israel has already taken over all the entry and exit points. And Israel has pushed Hamas to one corner. And now Israel wants to attack that corner. But the other side, the flip side is that 1.4 million people are also living in this place because Israel, even in the north, the operation Israel carried out is, it's a scorched earth operation. It's not a targeted attack on Hamas. It is a collective punishment. As Mr. Biden himself said, it's not my words. President Biden called it a collective punishment. He called it an indiscriminate bombing, indiscriminate attack. So this is Israel's way of attacking northern Gaza, and it will be the same in the south. So, this is from the Israeli point of view, they want to finish off the war. At least that's what they hope. And to do that, to meet the objective, they need to attack Rafah. And they don't care about the humanitarian cost. And they think that they can get away with, because even if there is friction between the United States and Israel, the US might pose. I think that itself is a major decision by the Biden administration. If you look at Biden's policies from October 7, this is the boldest position President Biden has taken. Because I think he started realizing that this is going out of his hands. Netanyahu is playing him. And the pressure is also mounting internally. So he can't let this go on forever. So he has taken this public position that he is not sending offensive weapons if Israel goes into Rafah. This also suggests that the American assessment of a Rafah attack is grim, pretty grim.
Right. So you're saying that the Biden's decision to pause the shipment of weapons, these bombs, could have a deterring effect, or Netanyahu is too hell bent on going ahead with his plans, regardless of whether the US supplies offensive weapons or not? Or do they need these weapons at all in the first place? Don't they already have enough in the bank, so to speak, to get this Rafah part of their military plans over with?
Yeah. So I don't know what Mr. Netanyahu will eventually decide, because if he doesn't attack Rafah and strikes a deal with Hamas, there is a possibility that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich will pull back from his government so that his government could collapse. So Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid could come and offer political support to the Netanyahu government in the Knesset. But even in that case, Netanyahu will be at the mercy of his political rivals. So Netanyahu's political future would be actually at risk here if he doesn't attack Rafah. But at the same time, I think Biden's pressure tactics is having some impact on Israel's overall military calculus because Israel has been talking about Rafah for quite some time. But they still haven't launched a full-scale attack on Rafah. So if the US is not exerting pressure, I think they would have done it much, much earlier. So they are, it is kind. Both sides are trying to use the cards they have, because yes, Israel may not need immediate weapon supplies from the Americans, but at the same time, this is a signal that the Americans are sending to the Israelis. So the signal is that it can have some effect on Israel's, long-term relationship with the United States if an Israeli prime minister goes ahead against the wishes of an American president, and he expressed his red line publicly, not secretly, not through diplomatic channels. The fact that Biden said this to the CNN, that suggests that Biden wants the world to know what his position is. So if Netanyahu is going against his will, this could create serious friction in the relationship. So I think this has symbolic value. This may have effect on the long-term relationship. But at the same time, you can also see that Israel may not need offensive weapons immediately to attack Rafah. Rafah is anyway, there are 4 Hamas battalions, and Israel can carry out the attack. Israel doesn't face any major conventional military threat from Rafah, right? But if, on April 14th, when Iran launched 330 drones, missiles, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, all those ballistic missiles and cruise missiles were shot down by the Americans, the French, and the Jordanians, along with Israelis, not just Israel alone, right? Netanyahu today says Israel has the strength to stand alone on its own, but that's not factual. Israel needs the support of the United States and its allies, especially when it comes to its conflict with Iran, right? So it is ingenuine for Netanyahu to say that Israel can stand on its own a few weeks after the Americans, the French, the Jordanians, and the British shot down most of the Iranian projectiles, isn't it? So Israel needs the United States. It's as simple as that.
Right. Israel needs the United States, and the United States has taken a kind of a little bit of a shift in terms of its unconditional support, so to speak, and especially with regard to offensive operations. So one last question, Stanley, on this before I let you go. So there have been a lot of student protests around the world, especially the ones in American campuses. In Ivy League university campuses have been making the headlines, and there have been repressive action against them from law enforcement in different Western capitals, UK, US. And do you think all these protests from the students is beginning to have an effect on the Western's support for Israel, either at the public level or at the governmental level? Because there does seem to be, like, a lot of people are making connections with the anti-Vietnam War protests as well. So do you think these protests have had any role to play in the shift of the Biden administration, so to speak, or was it coming anyway?
I think it was possible that the protest had an impact. Biden says he didn't change his policy because of the protest, but the fact is that he actually took this position, his boldest position till now, after the protest erupted. Because the United States has taken a very different approach towards the protest. They used to force to remove the protesters. They used to force to destroy the encampments. And the US media and the US government are trying to give a new twist, trying to build a new narrative that the protest is all about anti-Semitism. All those efforts are there. But at the same time, Biden, I think, also feels the heat. This doesn't mean that there will be a paradigm shift in the West's relationship with Israel. No, I don't expect that to happen. But there could be short-term policy changes. There could be some, major pressure impact on the policy decisions of the West, of the United States, basically, because Europe doesn't really come into the picture. No, they issue statements. Otherwise, here, at least when it comes to Israel, I think the United States is the most important, most significant voice. And the protests, I think, are having some kind of impact because this is also an election year. And Biden's core voters have started questioning the United States' unconditional support for Israel and the casualties, because the situation in Gaza is quite terrible. You haven't seen this kind of destruction in 21st century, right? 34,000 people have been killed. The entire population of Gaza has been displaced. 77,000 people have been wounded. And most of the displaced people are living in Rafah, and Rafah is now being bombed. There are not enough hospitals in Gaza. And the United Nations says there is a full-blown, within quotes, full-blown famine in northern Gaza. So this is terrible. This humanitarian crisis is terrible. And the West is known for its human rights values preaching, etc., right? So at the end of the day, there would be questions what the United States did, what the UK did when this calamity was being unfolded before the whole world. So I think this is what is building pressure on the streets, and that pressure is having some impact on, at least on the short-term policy decisions of these governments.
Right. Thank you for that, Stanley. As you rightly said, the West likes to preach about human rights and humanitarian support, etc. But when it comes to Gaza and Israel, I think the entire liberal or moral authority of the West seems to have become completely hollow, except, of course, the silver lining being the student protests in various Western capitals. But in Gaza, this is not going to really make much of a difference. A near famine or a full-blown famine situation, as you rightly pointed out. And with Israel now still not ready to back off from a Rafah operation, I think the coming weeks are going to be again very grim from the civilian point of view. We'll have to wait and watch how things pan out. Thank you so much, Stanley, once again for your observations and insights on this ongoing conflict. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sampath. My pleasure.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.